Hello, and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today it is the 6th of June, 2020, and there is a protest happening right now, starting right now, all the way to 5 p.m. at Parliament House, organized by the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance. The protest aims at providing solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement worldwide and specifically in the United States of America, and wants to draw attention to stopping Black deaths in police custody, an issue which plagues us here locally, alongside an entire history of oppression of Aboriginal people. I want to pay respects to the elders of the people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land I'm streaming from today, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Today we have a special guest, Courtney Vowles. Hello, Courtney. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I am very excited to chat with you about a multitude of topics. And Courtney is an author and a researcher whose research focuses on sexting and on youth online safety advocacy. So I'm very curious, how did you get involved in that work?
Okay, so when I first moved from New Zealand to Australia, I was working as a copywriter, and I was writing content designed to educate parents about risks that their children might face online. A lot of it was about cyberbullying, online addiction, gaming addictions, and social media. So through the process of that led to co-authoring a book that explores those issues. But also sexting is one of those issues that parents are acutely aware of at the moment. And I was instructed by my colleague and boss to share some materials about sexting that come from some pretty reputable institutions like the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner. And they contain some pretty problematic messages. So, for example, if you were someone who took a nude image and sent it to someone you trusted and then suspected that maybe it had been shared with other people, and you were looking at what to do about that, like what your options were legally and to get support, this material called So You Got Naked Online, which is available on their website, has the line in it, keep your private self a valued asset. Once someone has seen you naked, there's nothing more to know about you. And it occurred to me when I read that that's not a message I think is helpful for young people. I think it's harmful. And that kind of piqued my interests. And then I started to see if there was a wider theme of that. I found that these materials overwhelmingly do contain such problematic messages. And that kind of motivated me to go back to university and kind of investigate the full extent of that issue.
And it sounds like, this is an issue that can wade into some pretty tricky and, territory for us. What is your research actually about?
Yeah, I'd like to clarify that. So before doing that, I would just like to preface this with like a trigger warning. I'm not sure how deep we'll delve into it, but this could have kind of triggering consequences for some people. So, so I originally undertook honours, and in that I knew that I wanted to research whether or not these materials were found, whether it was just me who found the issue with them or that was a wider trend. So I basically collated a short list of like a corpus of materials. And I based that on what would come up on Google searches, like on the front page of Google. So reasonably accessible materials if you were to look online for help. And I did my own initial discourse analysis. And then off the findings of that, I did a survey. And overwhelmingly found that the trend was that if you read these materials, you would be less likely to seek help or report the abuse than beforehand. So they basically make you less likely to seek help. Which is significant. So now my PhD research is working off that knowledge. What do good materials look like? What is harm reduction, and what can promote help seeking? And so I'll be going and doing focus groups in Australian high schools with a mixture of both students, educators, and also maybe some e-safety practitioners.
So let me get this straight. You're saying that the materials that have been produced to ostensibly protect and help our young people who have been put into compromising positions actually harm them and reduce the likelihood of them seeking actual help?
Yeah. Bearing in mind, I should preface this with it was an exceedingly small sample, not representative. But I'm fairly confident those findings would hold over a large sample size. And even so, like it's indicative of a wider problem, which has been extensively researched in other fields like criminology and youth studies and the law. I mean, the law is a big one as well, because in leveraging that in these materials, often we position young sexters as like they get conflated with perpetrators and like predators because of child pornography laws that can, if a 16-year-old was to take a nude image of themselves, even though they can legally have sex with their partner, even just possessing it on their phone, if they don't send it to anyone, they've broken the law. And there have been cases where 16-year-olds get charged, put on the sex offenders register, and they can't become teachers or travel to some countries. And
for taking a nude image of themselves.
Yes, and on the basis that it's the production of child pornography. So that's an uphill battle that a lot of current literature is fighting. But the fact of the matter is that being so leveraged in these education materials is also another problem, because, there have been qualitative studies done where children are like, well, why would I tell the police? Like, I could be charged on child pornography charges. So there's lots of tiers to it, but victim blaming is overwhelmingly in like the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner did a large qualitative study, and the most common barrier to help seeking action was victim blaming.
I mean, it sounds like even the language around, you mentioned the pamphlet. I can't remember the exact wording, but so you've gotten online naked or something.
Got naked online.
Yeah, like that's a very victim blaming title to me. It sounds like it's focusing on the act of getting naked as like the bad problem.
Exactly. And the thing that confounds me to this day is that so you got naked online, right? It's past tense. The nude has happened. So why are the first 5 pages like, here's why you shouldn't sext? It's like it's anti-sexting propaganda, and I'm like, helpful. So it's I think in a like crude oversimplification of my research, everything just reads like anti-sexting propaganda. It's just like this innate moral panic is so prevalent that we're just like, just don't do it. It's this abstinence-only education. And not only do I not think that works, I also don't think it's the appropriate approach, because sexting isn't this inherently deviant, perverse act. I mean, right now we live in a time where sexual distancing is socially responsible. Like, there are a lot of people who can't visit their significant others, and it's a good way to maintain intimacy. And people just are so quick to condemn it because it just triggers that, like, that's never going to end well. And you're like, well, isn't that attitude part of why it doesn't?
So there's a couple of different things I think touched upon here. One is like considerations of underage and what that means ethically and legally. I'm interested in when you mentioned like a 16-year-old not being allowed to take photos, because the 16-year-old in Victoria is allowed legally to have sex.
Yeah. So in Australia and New Zealand, it's illegal if you're under 18 to sext. And like I said, you can be charged just for taking the nude image. You don't have to send it to anyone. It also becomes really problematic in instances where you might have a 16-year-old dating, or like a 17-year-old dating an 18-year-old, because then they become predatory if they possess an image, because then it's structured like it's child pornography, the possession of it. And those cases, the ones that actually go to court, tend to be interracial couples or gay couples, because if the parents find the images, it's an extension of an existing prejudice. And overwhelmingly, those are the most often ones that lead to like charges.
So you're saying that like this law is being used almost like in a weaponized way.
Mm-hmm. It's like condemned to protect. And there's like a book that I read extensively during honours called Sexting, Panic, and it unpacks a lot of those cases in America. And overwhelmingly, they were gay couples or interracial couples, and it was a mechanism of the parents kind of disproving of the relationship. So yeah, it's definitely being used as a weapon.
So that's one of the things that you touched upon, that kind of underage whole sphere. And then another thing that you've mentioned, I guess, is that sexting itself is not, you don't want to vilify it, but there's a lot of negative perceptions around it. So is your research about like the act of the sexting itself, or is it just about the non-consensual sharing of images after the sexting has occurred?
That's a good question. So for honours, you have to be quite specific, because it's a very confined amount of time and like quite strict word count. So I had to narrow the scope quite significantly. So I use the term image-based abuse. That is a broad phenomenon. So that encompasses a lot of different types of abuse. It's Very common one would be revenge porn. That's not a term I like to use because it's quite reductive. It not only is it like a media moniker, it's like a clickbait type terminology. It also reduces the scope of perpetration to like a jaded ex who's doing it for the purposes of revenge. And that's just not that doesn't encompass how it plays out. It can be used as a mechanism of control and coercion, humiliation. It could be exploitation, body shaming, bullying. And so when we use those terminologies, it does actually tie into how like the public reacts and how the laws react. So, it's very easy for it just to kind of create a binary where we picture a male and a female, and the jaded male ex puts it on like a Reddit porn site or something like that. And that's just not always how it plays out. But because for the specific avenue I was looking at was like, okay, so that you've consented to taking a nude image and you have concerns that it's been redistributed or know that it has, and you want to seek help. In order for that sequence to make sense, I had to necessarily like reduce the scope to people who did consent, because for victim blaming to play into it, there has to be that kind of initial decision to make it. So absolutely and categorically, creep shots would qualify as image-based abuse, but then we're removing that component of victim blaming, so it doesn't quite correlate with what I was investigating. So I'm hoping with my PhD to take a bigger, broader scope of how sexting plays out, including to take sex out of it, because sending nudes doesn't have to be a sexually loaded thing. It could be a way of, promoting your body and like self-love and body positivity. And there are different ways that sexting plays out. And we put on this tier of sexual hysteria, but it's not always about sex.
How prevalent is this non-consensual sharing of sexual images, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. So it affects about 20% of Australians, and it's, I think, 5% of New Zealanders. And it's quite common. I think it plays out in a lot of scenarios. It's not always intended as an assault. It's often intended, maybe you might get a nude of your girlfriend and think she has a phenomenal body and want to show that off. Sometimes it's an asset of social capital. So you have like a culture in teenage groups and schools of like collecting nudes, and like that gives you an asset of social capital in schools. So you show them as like collateral to your friends, like I have all these nudes, and it's like a byproduct of pics or it didn't happen kind of culture. So that's kind of how it plays out a lot of the time. It can also often be revenge based, or people just not really understanding that it's not a joke. And I think a big part of that, honestly, comes down to the fact that it's not put at the forefront of sex education. Like, we have to understand that sexting is absolutely part of modern sexual development. And a lot of the times it's an extension of a sex act. So it should be appropriately situated in sex education so that young people do learn about it. And another important argument that I make in my thesis, and that's kind of central to my foundational to my argument, is that image-based abuse isn't just a privacy violation, it's a bodily violation. So it's experienced overwhelmingly as a type of sexual abuse. And it's not easy for people to see it that because it's so disembodied, but there have been extensive victim studies done, and the characteristics of abuse and the way that it's experienced psychologically, mentally, physically are absolutely in line with offline abuse. They are consistent with domestic violence, significant psychological distress. There have been cases where people's images have been posted on sites with their addresses, and like things like, this person's down for sex. A woman has had people turning up at her house. So it can take on a very real effect. And I think we've got deadened nerves to the extent of that harm because it doesn't feel like a physical violation. Do you remember the fappening that occurred, or Celebgate? Yeah. Jennifer Lawrence said, like, everyone who looked at those images of me is complicit in violating me. And that's a really important takeaway. And I mean, even just last year when I was in the process of nearly submitting, there was the instance with Democratic Congresswoman Katie Hill in America, her ex-husband leaked nude images of her to the Republican Party. And she, because of the backlash, had to stand down. And everyone in the Republican Party who looked at those was complicit in her abuse, but that didn't matter. The focus was placed on her sexuality, and that made her like not appropriate for office.
I'm really struck also by the ways in which it's being used in a more politicized and targeted manner. I'm thinking about Gamergate when I say this, which was a big online harassment campaign that started with the like I guess like one particular relationship that ended up involving image-based abuse, and then from that, doxing became one of which is sharing personal information with the aim to harm. Became like one of the main weapons in this war, so to speak. I guess, can you speak to the ways in which image-based abuse is being used in these cultural wars online more broadly?
Yeah,
I think it's becoming more prevalent, at least.
I mean, it's always an extension of like a mechanism of control. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound like males aren't victims. They are overwhelmingly, though it's more likely to be females. Actually, some other statistics that came out of RMIT indicate that 1 in 2 Australians with disability will report being a victim. So people that includes being sent unsolicited nude images. So when there's a disability or a vulnerability component, and also 1 in 2 Indigenous Australians report being victims. Also, members of the LGBTQ community are more likely to be victims. So it plays out as like extensions of the rape culture we see offline. A lot of the times it's the same phenomenon, like repeating online. It is interesting because even though overwhelmingly people agree that it should be illegal to commit image-based abuse, 67% of surveyed Australians said that people should know better than to take nudes in the first place, even if they never send them. So it's a slut-shaming thing a lot of the time as well. That classic kind of you need to situate yourself somewhere between virgin and slut, and there's only that's the binary, and that impossible kind of demand for female nudity, but then also when you kind of give into that demand, you're a slut. And it's just like overwhelmingly the same trend. It's like a small facet of rape culture that I'm trying to kind of delve into here on the hopes that maybe we can change it before it completely saturates. I'm not sure if we're there yet, though. But another way that
it sounds like it intersects. Sorry, it sounds like it intersects a lot with the other vulnerabilities of society when people are marginalized for other reasons. Like it will increase the likelihood that they will be affected by this issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think education is so central. It's so easy. People ask me frequently what I'm studying, and I always give a crude simplification, but I see this I'm so familiar with now, which is kind of like, yeah, but there are risks. And you're like, sure, there are risks, but are the risks really guarantees? Are they inevitabilities? And I think a big part of that, and I mean, forgive me for showing my English like studies background here, but is the framing. It's even like the grammar of the way that these materials work. So there'll be a common line that you see is there was a line that said, you may think he will never hurt you, but you have to think of the worst case scenario. The image gets out. And I thought that was really interesting because in the structure of that grammatically, you get introduced with a he, an actor, an agent. And then in the context of the abuse, the agent gets taken away and it's just the image gets out seemingly of its own accord. So, you're assigning agency to a thing rather than to a human actor. And that's consistent. So that was like, I called that a passive voice assertion in my discourse analysis. And that was in every single material I analyzed. And that's significant because we're not talking to the agency of perpetrators. We're not assigning them with agency. We're just saying the image will get out. And when we treat that like an inevitability and treat privacy like it's just this facade or this thing that you'd be foolish to believe in, we have to then think critically and think, well, is that true in every capacity of digital media? Because my medical records are digital, my banking records are digital, and it would be a scandal if they were leaked.
Can you talk through, just on this note, sorry, I just want to underscore the point that you made previously first, though. You're saying that the agency is always assigned to the actor who ends up actually experiencing the abuse, and the agency of the perpetrator of the act is erased in the passive voice.
Absolutely.
And so then you're saying, when you consider other digital records like health or law, what do you call it, like police checks and things. You're saying it would be a scandal if those things came out. What? Yeah, I'm really curious. If I send a message to someone, that message isn't automatically confidential, but there is such thing as private and confidential online information. How does the digital aspect of it change the nature of how private that material is? And is there even privacy in the digital age?
It's a really, really good question. And I mean, obviously, it prompts a lot of conversation in the media and communication space. I certainly think that it's changed the way that we share and the things that we choose to make public. I do think it problematizes privacy for sure. I would be an idealist if I didn't acknowledge that. But I think that the case for sexting being an extension of a sex act more appropriately takes it away from being a communications act. And when you put it like that, you should understand the implicit and explicit norms that should govern that exchange. So don't treat it just like when you're having a funny group chat with your friends and you take a screenshot and you share it with someone else because, hey, look how funny my friend is. It doesn't play out that way. And so when people say that digital privacy is dead, we have to say, is that wholly true? And if it's not wholly true, then why can't it be applied to sexting? That's a time when we respect privacy. I mean, copyright is still a thing. And I mean, I don't think it should come back to something as clinical as copyright, but if it's your body, surely it's your copyrighted image. And I mean, it's certainly not my area of expertise to speak to the digital infrastructure that could remediate that harm, but I think it's out there. It's just we don't currently have the cultural value in it to incentivize it to be a thing. But I mean, even recently, I was looking at an academic journal on my phone and I went to take a screenshot and I couldn't. So there are these inbuilt mechanisms in my device that recognize an institution or a company's right to their privacy, but not people's. And there could easily be an app for sexting that does that. So I think it's about a cultural shift. Like I said, there's prevailing moral panics that are all tied up in sexual hysteria and like kind of antiquated morals around female sexuality a lot of the time, being the virginal body and abstinence being better. You're being more. There's an overwhelming theme, like in that quote I provided earlier, that once someone has seen you naked, you're no longer valuable, essentially, which I think is just. It makes my teeth hurt. It's just like, no. The notion that there's nothing more to know about you once someone has seen you naked is just so reductive. It's like, so that's my essence? That's knowing me? That's a bit confronting and depressing. So
yeah.
I think it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, if we just assigned agency to perpetrators, it would change. But certainly I think there's a big culture of smaller things that are at play that enable, and we don't want to talk about the ways in which we could uphold and value digital privacy. But there was a case in New Zealand where a man presented an emergency because he had put an eel in his anal passage. And
wait, sorry, hang on.
Yeah, you did hear that correctly.
Okay, just checking.
And the people who dealt with him were obviously like, wow, that's an interesting case. So they shared his x-rays and that got leaked and everyone got fired. And, obviously then you're like, oh, well, they're held to like confidentiality clauses because it's a professional capacity, whereas like individuals, it's different. But you're like, it's just that the legwork is there. We're just not trying to follow through a lot of the time, I think. So I do make an argument that obviously online privacy is trickier. And I mean, that there's someone in my cohort who's studying doxing and the harms of that. And we had to talk about how sometimes anonymity maybe is a more promising avenue than privacy per se, like de-identifying information as opposed to not having it out there because it takes away from the experience of you as a participant in public spheres online. But I do certainly think that the idea that it can't be upheld in this capacity isn't true, and that it just saying that emphasizes another rape denial culture where we just don't want to hold perpetrators accountable.
I think like a lot of these systemic issues, it's going to require a radical reimagining of every aspect of society, not just some sort of digital technology solution.
Yeah, that would be like a supplement, not a it wouldn't be the antidote. I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, I mean, I'm a big believer in education is where most of the solutions lie, which is why, you know, I was like, okay, well, I've pointed out a problem. I kind of want to help find a solution. I'm not convincing myself that my PhD research will be the whole solution, but I think certainly there's a case to be made for sexting being in the sex education curriculum. I mean, it's not hard to see through news articles and through popular culture that sexting is an issue that schools are dealing with, often in a reactive, haphazard, non-streamlined way. And I think even in emboldening teachers to have like a streamlined strategy. And I mean, I'm quite interested to sit down with the e-safety commissioner if I get the opportunity, and showing her that material that's currently on their website and saying to her, "Are you okay with this material being available? Like it's so bad." And I do understand that part of the trap comes in that, you know, obviously schools can't promote something that's technically illegal. So it can't be seen to be promoting sexting, but you can still condemn perpetration of abuse and talk about the ways that sexting can be ethical and grounded in consent and afford people their bodily autonomy. You know, that's the baseline of it. And there's lots of interesting avenues that I think could come out of a better quality of education.
And so just finally, in addition to these approaches where we actually start giving agency to the perpetrators and you know, making it clear that this is the problem that needs to be solved, that this is the proactive approaches that we should be taking through education and ensuring that we're not victim blaming. I imagine in this scenario that there would still ideally be tools for the victims of this image-based abuse who have had their images shared non-consensually. What kind of measures can you imagine being helpful in terms of harm reduction for those individuals that we can help them with?
So that's a good question. So in that report that I mentioned earlier, overwhelmingly what victims said that they wanted to see more was reassurance that they are not at fault and to not be blamed or judged. So slut shaming ties in with why people won't seek help. And, you know, like I mentioned earlier that the findings of my survey, which again was only about 40 people, but after reading each material, there are about 6 in the survey. I said, based on this, so not your ideological position, but based on this material, how likely would you be to seek help? And 63% of participants said somewhat to extremely unlikely. And that was just on the basis of those materials overall. And so when asked why, like a lot of the time they were like, well, I just feel like it wouldn't change my circumstances. And like the bottom line is just that I'm at fault. So not only are they not promoting the kind of the right feeling of support, but they're giving the impression that if you report it, it won't really change anything anyway. So we're failing these victims in a lot of ways. And I mean, I pull from an extensive psychological study that was done into institutional betrayal. So when institutions, and I think the focus of this study was universities, fail to respond appropriately to abuse, they actually create an environment where it's more prevalent and likely to occur. And they compound the experience of trauma for victims. So I think basically if a friend expresses a concern on this front, reassurance they're not at fault. That, you know, if the baseline that you want people to take away from this is that you're foolish to ever trust anyone with your naked image, then I don't think that's something a hill we should all be willing to die on. You know, I think reassurance they're not at fault, that is the thing that overwhelmingly victims want to hear and they're not hearing.
I really hope that these systems can change, that rape culture can be eradicated and dismantled here in Australia and abroad. And thank you for the work that you do in advocating for that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll be sure to watch the space. Keep you posted. What we find.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for joining us at the Distillery. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
You're watching The Distillery, a casual series of online interviews. I'm your host, Harry Li Shanglun. You can find us online at distillery.site, follow us on Instagram at distillery.site, or on Twitter at distillery_site. Do check out all the episodes, and we have new episodes streaming daily. And if you do choose to go to the protest today, Do practice physical distancing, wear masks, use hand sanitizer. Take care, everyone. See you soon.